Hi, I'm Susan Dixon. I want to welcome everybody who's joining us tonight. I'm the program chair of the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California, and we are pleased to have uh, Vivian Yan-Gonzalez to be our speaker tonight. She is a historian of race and politics in 20th century United States. She's assistant professor of Asian American Studies at Chapman University. Uh, for her education, she was a Mellon Mays Fellow at USC. She got her PhD in history at Stanford and then did some postdoc research at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. So I'm glad to welcome her. If you have questions, please put them in the chat and enjoy.
Thank you all so much for being here. Let me start off by saying thank you to the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California for hosting me. I'm especially excited for our conversation today, in part because of all the ways that the Chinese Historical Society community has actually intersected with my career and with my research. So I went to USC for college. As Susan mentioned, I interned while I was there at the Chinese American Museum in LA in 2013. And it was through that experience that I first got to know the Chinese Historical Society. And then once I started the research for my doctoral dissertation at Stanford in 2019, I actually came back to the Chinese Historical Society for some of my research leads and really benefited from the generosity and depth of knowledge that folks there shared with me. So I am super grateful now to have this chance to share a little bit of what I've learned with you all. And I'm very much looking forward to all of your comments and questions at the end. I'm excited for our conversation. So let me first share my screen. So I hope you're all able to see that fine. So today I'm going to be talking to you about Chinese American political thought, an intellectual biography of Y.C. Hong. So I am a political historian. What I like to do in my approach to political history is to think about not just, who is voting for who is voting for whom and why they're doing that, or kind of what parties are doing, what kind of what kind of machinations are going on. But I also like to think about how it is that people understand politics and what politics and political engagement means to them, how people understand the value of the franchise, what kinds of options they have as political actors, and these kinds of questions. So this is what I'm going to kind of be doing with my talk today. So I want to start by introducing Los Angeles lawyer Y.C. Hong, who many of you are probably already familiar with. He's especially well known as an immigration attorney who worked on some 7,000 cases in his lifetime. And, he was a real foundation for the growth of the Chinese American community here because of that work. And in addition to his business and to his profession, he was also known as a foundational leader for the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, or the C.A.C.A., which is the country's oldest existing civil rights organization. And this organization formed in order to defend and to exercise Chinese Americans' citizenship rights. So here we have a nice image of the C.A.C.A. Los Angeles Lodge from 1928. And you can see Y.C. Hong in the middle there with kind of, this edgy slouch going on. Love this picture. So in addition to Hong's political activity, he was also one of the best known Chinese American Republicans in California. He was somebody who organized fundraisers, placed campaign ads, met with politicians, and was really recognized as this Chinese American community leader by various political figures. So you might have known about Hong's political affiliation already because of images like this, but his politics is one of the least discussed aspects of his life, even though the evidence for his partisan engagement is so extensive and rich. In fact, through my research in the Hong family archives at the Huntington Library and Gardens here in San Marino, I've come to see that Hong's activism with the C.A.C.A. was actually foundational in defining his political thought. So, why is it the case that we know about Y.C. Hong as this champion for oppressed Chinese Americans, but we don't really know about him as a political thinker and a strategist? So my answer is that our ways of understanding how race and politics work for Asian Americans has prevented us from seeing the whole picture of Y.C. Hong and of many other Asian American voters. So there are two competing narratives about Asian Americans and politics. This first narrative is something you may have heard of called the model minority narrative. And this narrative argues that Asians are culturally passive, quiet, apolitical, right? They don't rock the boat, they don't really speak out. And one result of this narrative is this common belief that Asian Americans didn't engage in politics at all until the late 1960s, which is when young activists in the Asian American movement joined these radical social movements of the Vietnam War era. And then the second narrative of Asian Americans in race and politics is a direct reaction to the first, a direct reaction to the model minority narrative. And so this resistance narrative was developed by those same young Asian American activists, and they argued that the reason why Asian Americans seemed to be model minorities was because Asians had been so completely oppressed by white supremacy that they were forced to be passive, silent, and apolitical in order to survive in this hostile society. And so this resistance narrative argues that authentic Asian American politics are, by definition, liberal or even left. And this is the narrative that leads many people to assume that if you're a minority, you must be a Democrat. It's the same reason why many people might look at a conservative of color and assume all sorts of things, such as maybe they're ignorantly voting against their own interests, maybe they're some kind of a sellout, maybe they hate their own culture, right? There are these kind of really not very pleasant narratives that people use to try to explain what they see as this paradox, to explain what they see as something that is racially inauthentic. So when we have these two narratives, right, that Asian Americans were not political until the late 1960s, and that Asian Americans who care about their communities, right, racially defined communities, must be on the left side of the political spectrum, then what happens is we don't really have a way to understand somebody like Y.C. Hong, somebody who was committed to his community's welfare, and somebody who actively engaged with partisan politics all throughout his life as a Republican. So in this talk, I'm going to be exploring Hong's political thought as it relates to Chinese American community welfare, and I'm going to show three things. First, his activism with the C.A.C.A. was central to shaping the way he understood politics and to developing his own political thought. Second, he was deeply inspired by the American principles of justice and equality. He believed deeply in the American democratic system, and yet he was a pessimist when it came to race relations. And so I argue that this shaped his preference for gradual change within the existing political structure, along with a constant concern for defending whatever progress his community could achieve. My research for this talk comes from a larger book project that I'm working on, which is a political history of the first generation of Chinese and Japanese American voters in California. It traces their coming of age in the 20s, 30s, 40s, follows them through the maturation in World War II and the early post-war years, and then concludes by examining how the political cultures that they established responded to changes in American politics and society in the 1960s and 70s. And I argue that this first generation of Asian American voters, Hong was among this generation, that these people were quote unquote impossible citizens. Right? Citizens of Asian descent who grew up in a country that banned citizenship for Asians. And I'm happy to talk more about my book in the Q&A. So to go back to this conversation about the model minority narrative and the resistance narrative, what I want to emphasize in this talk is that these are two ideological stories about how Asians are supposed to be. They don't really describe how Asians are so much as they prescribe, right? They prescribe or they set expectations for what we think Asians should be, what we think they should be, how we think they should act. So my book and today's talk try to show how the historical record challenges the stories that we tell ourselves today about how race and politics work. And by breaking down these stories, we can better understand the true diversity and complexity of Asian American politics and history. So we're going to start with the C.A.C.A's first big legislative campaign in order to see how Hong's political character began to emerge. The 1924 Immigration Act passed just 1 month before Hong graduated from USC Law School. This law was the culmination of a massive nativist movement, a massive anti-immigration movement after World War I, and it sharply limited all immigration to the United States. This law also consolidated the regime of Asian exclusion. So what had begun with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, continued with the 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone Act, was now being completed with this 1924 Act, which was also known as the Japanese Exclusion Act. This law, this 1924 law, also laid the legal groundwork to create this category of people that we know today as illegal or undocumented immigrants, but that's a different story. Chinese Americans, though, had a particular problem with this new law. For years, family-based exemptions had allowed American citizens of Chinese ancestry to bring their non-citizen wives to the United States in spite of the Chinese Exclusion Act. But the 1924 Immigration Act eliminated those exemptions. So the C.A.C.A. turned to an energetic young attorney, Y.C. Hong, for help in what would become a decades-long campaign to end family separations of Chinese Americans. So when they reached out to Hong, he immediately responded with his trademark determination. He said, "I am willing to do anything within my power for the general welfare." Telegrammed this to his friend and C.A.C.A. leader Kenneth Fung in August 1924. Although the C.A.C.A. encountered some setbacks when it tried to challenge the law in court the following year, Hong remained optimistic. He said in a separate letter, "While there's still a ray of hope, it is our duty to find a way out." So Hong went on to write a pamphlet for the C.A.C.A. that was called A Plea for Relief, and this outlined their primary arguments before Congress and helped to publicize their case. In February 1928, Hong himself traveled to Washington, D.C. to testify before Congress, and he would do that one more time later. But his optimism was starting to waver. In 1929, Hong wrote a letter to his future wife, Mabel, saying, quote, "The exclusionists are determined to keep the Oriental population in this country down to the lowest minimum. Within 10 years' time, persons of Oriental ancestry born in this country will be denied citizenship. The inevitable will come. That is one of the reasons I am planning to go to China." Right? He was planning to leave this country. Hong, like many other Chinese Americans of his generation, saw a limited future in the country of his birth due to racial discrimination. One historian has found that something like 30 to 40% of Chinese Americans who were born in this country would at some point go back to China, or actually go to China since they were born in the United States, because racial discrimination in the United States was that severe. So Hong was afraid that not only would the C.A.C.A. fail in its fight for family reunification, but that Asians would lose access to citizenship entirely. And he darkly anticipated the day when his country would strip him of citizenship, forcing him to abandon the fight and leave. And finding any kind of reliable allies within the white majority, even among those you might expect to be progressive reformers, was unlikely. Hong explained one example to Mabel, the 1922 Cable Act. So in the past, American citizenship law had followed these patriarchal norms that tied a woman's political and legal status to her husband's. So a woman would lose her US citizenship if she married a foreigner and would automatically take her husband's citizenship. But after women successfully gained the right to vote in 1920, they also demanded the right to retain their citizenship separate from their husbands. So this 1922 Cable Act then allowed American women to keep their citizenship after marrying foreigners, with one exception: if they married somebody from a, quote, race ineligible to citizenship. This phrasing was a thinly veiled way to target Asians, since only Asians were barred from becoming citizens. And this law then targeted Asian American women in particular because they were most likely to marry non-citizen Asian men. So Hong wrote to Mabel, "No, it is not right, but certainly your white sisters who are enjoying equality in every respect are not going to fight in your behalf." He grimly concluded, "Equality is only a high-sounding principle to be talked about and nothing more. There is no equality in anything." The C.A.C.A's family reunification struggle did win a very narrow concession in 1930 when Congress decided to allow Chinese women who had married before the 1924 Immigration Act took effect to then join their husbands in the US. So this was a very narrow window, very narrow population of women. Hong's archives don't really show how he responded to that decision, but the comments that he wrote to Mabel the month before this narrow concession came down suggest that he retained faith in the principles of American law. He quoted Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest lawyers in history. "I am not bound to win, but I am bound to be true. I must stand by anybody that stands right. Stand with him while he is right and part with him when he is wrong. Law is a wonderful profession for those with high ideals." And you can imagine Hong, right, counting him as one of those people. So Chinese Americans still had a long way towards achieving equality at this point, but Hong likely felt vindicated that his arguments, his contributions could make an impact, however small, towards justice. And it's also telling that Hong quoted Lincoln in this letter. And it helps give us a little bit of an insight into why most Chinese Americans of Hong's generation actually supported the Republican Party. And so here we need to think back to nearly 100 years ago and consider how the parties have drastically changed over time. Although both the Democratic and Republican parties had contributed to the anti-Asian movement, by the 1920s, the GOP was still known as the party of Lincoln, right, the great emancipator. And the Democrats were still known as the party of Jim Crow rule in the South. Also, Republicans held a near monopoly over politics in California, thanks to progressive era rules and mechanisms like cross-filing, which were intended to eliminate partisanship, but instead cemented Republican power. And then third, the GOP was more favorable towards China's sovereignty. And this was an important factor for many Chinese Americans whose families in China lived under the constant threat of imperial invasion, political insecurity, and other kinds of turmoil. So if you were a minority trying to get a political foothold, why not support the Republican Party, a party already in power that was marginally less racist? So these early years shaped Hong into what I'm describing as a principled pessimist, somebody who believed in justice, but was deeply skeptical of achieving it. And I think that Hong remained remarkably consistent throughout his life, following three key ideas that formed the center of his political thought: racial pessimism, politics as defensive, and faith in democracy. So I'm going to give you a little bit more historical context here. Hong lived through major changes in American attitudes towards race, right? He grew up in the era of Asian exclusion, but as an adult, He experienced the rise of new opportunities for minorities that emerged in World War II and in the early Cold War. Part of this new racial liberalism in the 1940s and 50s was led by the Democratic Party under the New Deal, but a very strong and influential faction of Republican moderates and liberals contributed to this as well, right? That legacy of Lincoln. But even though Chinese Americans began to experience new opportunities, better access to jobs, better housing, changing immigration and naturalization laws, and so forth, Hong doubted that they marked any real or lasting change in the heart of American racial attitudes. So the victories that Chinese Americans won on family reunification, for instance, were repeatedly threatened and had to be constantly defended. So, for instance, the Chinese exclusion laws were repealed in 1943 during World War II, but that repeal eliminated the exemption that the C.A.C.A. had won back in 1930. Then in 1946, the Chinese Alien Wives of American Citizens Act gave Chinese Americans the victory they had been hoping for, right? A full admission of Chinese wives of US citizens without conditions outside of the Chinese quota. But then just 3 years later, they had to defend that victory against a bill that would have lifted the whole infrastructure of Asian exclusion, but again have placed Chinese wives under a minuscule limited quota. And finally, the non-quota status of Chinese wives was successfully maintained in the 1952 Immigration Act. So this back and forth, this constant struggle contributed to a first key idea, racial pessimism, or the belief that white racial attitudes were unlikely to ever genuinely change. And I have a few quotes from the 1950s that illustrate this kind of bitter view. In 1955, C.A.C.A. representatives testified before Congress to appeal for relief for Chinese American children whose applications for U.S. passports were severely backlogged at the embassy in Hong Kong. The C.A.C.A.'s testimony was joined as well by the Boston Chinatown Post of the American Legion, which is a prominent veterans organization. But the American Legion sent several of its national leaders to testify in opposition against their own subsidiary group. And so Hong wrote resentfully to a friend, quote, "This should be a clear lesson to our Chinese people that it is futile to depend on the help of these so-called prominent American organizations. You just get snowed under by their prejudices and selfish policies." Hong believed that Asians were viewed as permanent foreigners, right? Forever foreigners, who would always suffer the consequences of having racialized faces. So one handwritten note in his archives began, quote, "Whether we like it or not, the fact remains that Americans of Chinese descent will never quite escape the consequences of their heredity as long as they are physically identifiable as such." And it's likely that Hong was writing this note in the early 1950s as he reflected on the rise of anti-communist related harassment, McCarthyism, during the Korean War that linked Chinese Americans to communist China. And so this led Hong to a second key idea, that politics was a battle of constant vigilance, constant defense. So even in the program for the C.A.C.A.'s Valentine's Day dance in 1954, Hong was sounding a dire warning to attendees. This festive occasion was happening at the height of McCarthyism, and so Hong wrote, quote, "In a free society, we have no escape from social responsibilities. At no time in our history has it been so important to be good citizens first. The coming election will offer us another opportunity to prove our right to the American way of life." So Hong believed that voting was this essential duty that asserted Chinese Americans' patriotism and proved that they were good citizens. And these were key statements, he believed, that could preemptively counter the suspicions of others. In addition to serving a symbolic purpose, voting was also necessary to protect Chinese Americans' interests. So in Hong's archives, I found an envelope for a sample ballot on which Hong had written some thoughts reflecting on the C.A.C.A.'s purpose as an organization of citizens. He wrote, "Political action is an inherent and necessary part of our existence. We must engage in political activity or face the possibility that the economic, political, and social gains we have won in the past decades may be wiped out overnight by legislation. And this was a common idea that Hong would repeatedly express, that political participation was required to protect the progress that they had achieved against a potential sudden backlash. And you may have noticed that in Hong's Valentine's Dance message, he emphasized that voting was required to maintain a, quote, free society. And this leads me to Hong's third key idea, which is that despite the enduring racism of the white majority, the American democratic system remained a viable structure for achieving equality. Hong's notes and drafts for speeches to the C.A.C.A. expressed these ideas most clearly. So in one draft from the 1950s, Hong wrote, quote, "Let us understand the American conception of the dignity of man under God and the law. Let us understand that this is the cornerstone of our American free enterprise system. Free men, if they are to remain free, must be informed and must be willing to sacrifice much for freedom." These flowery words echoed this patriotic language that we often hear, right, of the sacrifices that are required to maintain freedom. But another phrase, that the US system was rooted upon the dignity of man under God and the law, also reflected this maturation of Hong's early faith in the principles of the law. So Hong wasn't just parroting patriotic language as the sort of symbolic, superficial demonstration of anti-communism. Instead, he genuinely believed in the American system. Yet, Hong also adopted a realist perspective in his defense of democracy. So in notes and drafts for another speech, he wrote, "Whatever the imperfections of America, here is one of the few societies in which the individual still may air his views and have them heard. No society has ever been absolutely good, free, or just. No such society is ever likely to appear on this earth. Those who hope for the realization of absolutes will be disillusioned." So in other words, Hong argued that the US was not the greatest society in the world. It wasn't a perfect society. He refused to idealize it, but it was good enough. So thinking through Hong's political thought from the 1930s to 50s helps us understand a particularly fascinating pair of documents that gives insight to how Hong may have shaped the Chinese American response to the civil rights movement. Now, it's unclear whether these were personal notes or drafts of his speech, but what they show is, again, that Hong genuinely believed in the potential of American democracy, but that his pessimistic fear of white backlash made him unwilling to support risky or provocative tactics. One such note began, "I don't believe there are any grounds at all for jumping to the conclusion that the Negro protest movement is dominated by the communists." Just as a side note, this term Negro was the historically polite term to use at that time. "If I were a Negro, I too would protest, but I would not try to marry the movement to the liberal left movement." So a few key points here stand out. First of all, Hong rejected outright this common claim that the civil rights movement was a communist plot. This was a racist conspiracy theory that essentially argued that African Americans actually liked Jim Crow segregation and that they were incapable of political sophistication, of major political activity and movements, unless white people, usually Jews, were controlling the strings. So Hong rejected this conspiracy theory, but at the same time, he warned that the civil rights movement should avoid being too closely associated with the left because it could damage their reputation. On a philosophical level, however, Hong genuinely believed in America as a free society and opposed socialism. So his note continued, "There are millions of Americans, regardless of their racial origin, who wish to fight prejudice but who do not wish to commit themselves to the socialization of American life, to throwing away the present federal system, idolizing our political parties, inviting the federal government to supervise our lives." And these comments show Hong's emphasis on political moderation, right? A system of checks and balances to prevent extreme government overreach, a healthy skepticism towards extreme partisanship, extreme ideology. And these statements aligned Hong well with other centrists in both the Republican and Democratic parties who believed, again, that equality, that justice could be achieved within the existing structures of American democracy. Now, you might have also noticed that Hong expressed sympathy with Black protesters, but would he really join them in protest as he claimed? So another handwritten draft, which reflects on the approaching March on Washington in 1963, suggests that he actually preferred a much more traditional approach. He wrote in these notes, "If a person can vote and does vote, demonstration is not necessary. Demonstrations help dramatize the demand for equality, but one must stop and think whether it is worth the money, effort, and risk of having a march which might blow up into a messy riot which does more harm than good. A few rotten apples can oftentimes ruin the whole barrel and undo all the good previously obtained." Now, Hong's comments revealed a major oversight on his part, since an obvious goal of the civil rights movement was a fight to achieve voting rights in the first place. And he was also echoing widespread fears that the March on Washington would end in violence, which would jeopardize the Civil Rights Act that President Kennedy had just recently proposed in Congress. At the same time, Hong recognized the potential gaps in his knowledge. "As a Chinese American," he wrote, "and one of the members of the minority group, I personally prefer to be a spectator, but I do not mean to speak against the Negro leaders arranging it, and neither would I support it. If they think that this is the right thing to do, they have a clearer idea of what is best course than I have." So once again, I see this as Hong expressing his views of politics as defensive, right, designed to protect every inch of progress for the Chinese Americans against this unreliable white majority. It was his experience as a minority who had struggled against racism that shaped this preference to be a neutral, quote, spectator. So to me, I see him as a political centrist who argued that despite deep-seated racism among many white Americans, the federal system of government remained the best structure for pursuing equality, and he was cautious in his approach, preferring to work through the established structures for change in order to create gradual reform, one small step at a time. The C.A.C.A. did not send a delegation to the March on Washington, unlike the Japanese American Citizens League, which was an organization with similar goals in its founding principles and activities. And indeed, Hong's hometown of Los Angeles, right, our hometown of Los Angeles, hosted the C.A.C.A.'s biennial convention just 2 weeks before the march. The resolutions that were passed did not comment on the civil rights movement or on the march, but Hong was watching. He typed up quotes from the key speakers and he kept them in his files. And so this speaks to me of the duality of Hong's political thought. He was deeply skeptical towards white Americans and the possibility that change in the US racial landscape was genuine or long-lasting, but at the same time, he believed strongly in American principles and legal structures, and he hoped, however pessimistically, for the day when those principles might become reality for all. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. If we were all meeting in person, I guess I would call for a round of applause. And thank you for taking the time and also for sharing your really deep research and history. We had asked for questions and comments in the chat. Maybe it's my technology, but I don't see any questions in the chat. Maybe I can just share a very brief question, and then maybe that would spark some other questions or comments. But I also see Nolan Hong online, and what perhaps we could do is actually start off with some comments from Nolan. And
okay, Gene, I'm here, and I have very much impressed with the thoughtfulness that Vivian has given in her research and deep thought to the problems of minorities. And we are still considered minorities. But as my father thought, the best thing we can do is to participate actively and speak up in a way that makes sense. Here in Los Angeles, of course, we've had a number of recent demonstrations which have caused terrible riots and pain to a lot of people, and those of Hispanic origin are suffering many of the things, even in a worse way than the Chinese have in the past. So I still believe that we need to participate actively in politics. We have now many people of Chinese descent who are in politics and are very involved in politics. And I think that's critical to gain acceptance and recognition by more and more people. I think that racism is something that may be inherent in what we are as human beings. And that's a very unfortunate situation, but I think it's something that is true. But at the same time, we really need to be active in every way we can and participate actively and speak up when necessary in a logical and thoughtful way.
So what's coming through, Nolan? What I hear from Vivian here, and thank you, Vivian, for your research. It seems like you must have spent a lot of time at the Huntington and interviewing people to reach some of these conclusions. And it appears that he was very pragmatic and circumspect about attitudes toward race and community. But Nolan, I was wondering, what did you talk about at the dinner table? Was this something that were some of those discussions, what sparked you toward your own career in the law?
We really didn't have discussions at the dinner table, although my father and I were very close. And so we would talk about problems just between the two of us. And one of the things he emphasized to me was that in whatever you do, you really have to do it as well as you can. And that being accomplished in what you endeavor will give you recognition and be very helpful. And that was his emphasis to me. You really have to work hard at whatever you pursue. One of the things I found, which may be somewhat interesting, is that in my practice of law, I found that being Chinese was actually helpful because judges and juries, as a matter of fact, were not accustomed to seeing Chinese, and having them be able to communicate with them in a manner that was
You talk just like an American.
that they can understand.
Yeah.
And so I think that's still, and this is, I think, a goal for all uh, Chinese families in particular, as well as other Asian families who make every effort to be as accomplished as they can. I mean, I find it interesting these days when you go on TV and you see advertisements, and particularly as far as medical matters are concerned, and the advertisements show Asian doctors or Asian nurses who are giving advice. And so I think that's, in a way, as much as I dislike advertisements, that's a very forward move that people can relate to. And I hope it continues in that fashion.
So there's a question in the chat that both Vivian and you, Nolan, might be able to weigh in on. Have we moved the needle? Have we made progress in the things that he argued for? Or are we still in the same place? We still have to work twice as hard to prove ourselves, or we have to identify ourselves as real Americans?
I think this is such an interesting question, if I can jump in and answer.
Yes, you can.
I think there's two ways you can ask this question, right? Who is us that we're talking about in this question? Are we talking about us as in Chinese Americans, or are we talking about us as in American society, right? Because I think Hong very much saw himself as both, right? Working for Chinese Americans, but committed to this American system of government. So have Chinese Americans made progress? Yes, in so many ways, right? Like as Nolan was mentioning, you see, Asian American faces on the big screen. You see Asian American professionals. We have Asian Americans like in the federal government working at some of the highest levels of power. Asians have made huge progress. What kind of progress has the American democratic system made? I think that is a very different and very complicated question. And I think that as somebody who was very firmly committed to these sorts of traditions and safeguards of the American democratic system, it's really a valid question as to what would Y.C. Hong think of the political situation today, right? If somebody was so committed to a sort of moderate politics, what do we make of the extreme polarization that we experience today? And what role do we as Asian Americans have in this situation, right? Do we simply say Chinese Americans are doing well and that's good? Or do we say that there is something else that we must do as Americans?
No, there definitely is a more visible presence of Chinese Americans in the political arena. Now, YC was national president of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, as you were also, and as was also Munson Kwok, who was also weighed in on the chat here. Maybe all three of you could comment on that, on the national picture. What do people across the country, or Chinese Americans across the country, and whether in Texas or New York, how do they feel? And I actually want to go back to this observation early on that you made, Vivian, that YC supported Republican politics, but we also know that the direction of the party has changed over the years. When he started, maybe Calvin Coolidge or Herbert Hoover were the Republican presidents. And then later, other Republicans who came on board later, Eisenhower and Nixon, were were actively involved in the political world. So I wonder how he thought of some of these political leaders and whether they were doing any good. I think that some of the presidential leadership helped pull us out of the depression, the Great Depression. But then it was really Roosevelt's New Deal, which created a lot of the institutions that we have today. So what I wonder what he thought of in terms of how we were becoming more of a socialized society, and maybe weigh that against past and current Republican politics. I know that's a multi-part question, but maybe you've probably gotten into C.A.C.A enough to be able to share some of that insight.
I think there's actually not very much specific information in the archives about such and such politician's policies were nice and such politician was not doing so well, or such and such policy was good or bad. I think what we do see is, again, this sort of pragmatic recognition that a lot of California's most influential political leaders were Republicans, right? So, for instance, William F. Nolan from Oakland was California's senator, one of the most powerful political figures in the country while he was in the Senate. And so, it would make sense to cultivate a person like William F. Nolan, who was also known, infamously so, for his concern with Taiwan and the so-called Free China. He was a deep anti-communist warrior. And as part of his work, he became known by his critics as the senator from Formosa, right? The senator from Taiwan. And so if somebody's going to bat for people, for Chinese people overseas, right, that can offer some visibility, some kind of access and political leverage to you as a Chinese American. And so I think there are some strategic ways in which we see Y.C. Hong and the C.A.C.A. making certain kinds of relationships with politicians who were powerful and influential in California.
And perhaps during the Cold War, during the height of McCarthyism, what were some of his thoughts about that?
I think he, was very careful about being sure not to be seen as an extremist, right? He would warn the C.A.C.A., for instance, or other friends who were fighting for immigration reform. He would say, watch out, such and such magazine has labeled anybody who was advocating for this position as, as a red. And he would warn people about kind of the public image that they had to cultivate and the public image they had to craft in order to achieve their goals. So he was conscious of what was operating, what was happening. That's why he also, right, in a Valentine's Day dance, for goodness sake, like people just going to dance at a Valentine's Day party, he told them, you've got to be vigilant, you've got to be a good citizen. Now is not the time to just, kick back and go bowling and go dancing. We still need to be, good citizens and be careful because, when it comes to American foreign policy, unfortunately, and this is often still the case today, Americans are not always the best at telling the difference between people of Chinese descent or people of Japanese descent or people of whatever descent in our country versus those countries and their governments abroad. So he was very careful about making sure that that Chinese Americans were open and aware of the context in which they were operating.
So Chung notes in her comments that she interviewed Y.C. back in 65. I don't know how many years ago that was. But anyway, sorry, Supong. But he commented, apparently he felt that the younger generation should be more proactive in politics. And perhaps you saw that in some of his writings. I think you shared some of that already, but but so Nolan, I see, became involved as a lawyer and didn't become a political leader. Uh, Maybe there was risk in that, but I always wonder really what motivates people who to get involved, and did he maybe mentor a few people in moving in that direction, in maybe taking a higher profile stand. Uh, it took a long time before we had uh, some of the elected leadership that we see today. Uh, so I guess I'm just sort of uh, expanding on Sufan's comment that he did encourage people to become more involved or more proactive in politics.
Well, can I,
That
if I
yes,
can make a short comment, and then I'd love to invite Nolan to talk a little more about this. You mentioned, Nolan, that, your father was very, influential, kind of shaping some of your personal philosophies. Nolan, you were also involved in the Republican Party's All Nationalities Council for a while. I think the question of whether Hong mentored any other individuals is an interesting one. In the archives, I haven't seen much evidence for that. But Nolan, I don't know if you'd like to jump in here and talk more to Jean's questions.
Well, much of what you have picked up from the archives are personal thoughts that he had as he was viewing things. But his encouragement, I think, for everybody is that you have to not be dedicated to, let's say, one political party or another. You do have to find people who are willing to listen to you. And that's the most important thing that you have to look for. And many times people will listen to you because you're helpful to them in some way. And, frankly, he wasn't a great fan of Richard Nixon. But on the other hand, Nixon reached out to the C.A.C.A. As well as my father. And so that was worthwhile. And so you don't necessarily have to believe in everything that people stand for, but if they're helpful to your cause or what you believe in, then it's worthwhile to get close to them and to provide actually some support if necessary. Nixon was there because he wanted votes. And, that was the whole basis for it. Senator Nolan wanted votes. And that's why he came to Chinatown and met with the Chinese leaders because he felt that it was worthwhile. So even though we may have to look at the selfish side of people, we're human beings and we relate to others when they're helpful to us. And I think that that's something we really need to look at and to be conscious of.
yeah,
Hey, Jean, can I ask a question?
sure.
Hi. Hi, everyone. It's Jenny Cho. Hi, Nolan.
Hi, Jenny.
Great
Nice
to see you.
you all.
Yeah.
Vivian, what a wonderful presentation. We've never met, but thank you so much for all the work you've done in preserving this history. I was wondering if you guys ever made a video about Y.C. Hong. I think I interviewed Nolan 13 years ago, and I don't know if you remember Nolan, but I'd be happy to contribute that if you guys ever did one. Don't volunteer me, Jean. Thanks.
You just already put the bug in my mind. So since
There
you're
is
coming
a
over,
there is a documentary about Y.C. Hong by Rick Kwan, and I'm going to put a link to that,
Oh, great.
to some information about it in the chat. It's a wonderful documentary. It does not talk too much about his political activity, though.
no.
I think, well, your research, Vivian, I think in video form would be great as well. Just putting it out there, not to make more work for you.
I appreciate that.
Well, it'd be great to transcribe what you recorded, Jenny, and then hopefully we can share it, in various ways that we can.
Yeah, sure.
Uh, so I saw another question. Oh, Katie had a question. I think she wanted to see if there has been research on voting patterns, whether voting records from the 20s and 30s and 40s are available, and whether some of the political discussions going on at the time, whether it be repeal of the Exclusion Act or any other issues. Kate yourself being a part of the family who from Sam Ward, who was called the mayor of Chinatown, I think was very much probably involved in the community politics, but on the larger scene, I wonder if there was any impact at all from the community in the 20s and 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love this question. So when I started my research, that was one of the things I wanted to know. Is there any data out there, right? Because there's tons of polling data now. But it turns out there's basically nothing that exists on Asian American voting patterns before 1980. Before 1980, like 80, 84, essentially. Almost nothing. And so what we have voting records of, kind of collected voting records of, different districts, say in Los Angeles or in San Francisco or other places, on how they may have voted, how certain neighborhoods and precincts may have voted on different issues, different propositions, etc. But we don't have a sort of race-specific, ethnic-specific breakdown. But what we do have, and what some of my other future research is going to be delving into, is historical voter registration rolls. And these are documents that counties kept that included the name of the individual, their address, their profession, and their political partisan affiliation. So this material exists going back for many years. I think it's for Chinese for Asian Americans, the relevant years that that are usually available are about like 1910 to like 1940, 1950. And I was actually able to use some of this data. I know we're past time, but I don't know if I can share some of this data.
We can keep going. Yeah, I think this is very interesting.
Okay. So I am working, and I'm happy to share information about this, a link to this as well. I am working on a digital history project that would map these voter registrations. Essentially, what I have tried to do is look for Chinese and Japanese and other Asian American looking surnames, which is a very weird kind of research methodology, right? It's kind of like racial profiling, but like in the history books. So it's very strange. But what I try to do is find people who are probably voters of Asian descent and look at their political partisan affiliation, any other kind of demographic data that's available. And I've tried to map some of that. And so you can see that, oops, let me see if I think I closed my screen share. So I've tried to map some of that here. I did a small survey just to see if this was a possible project. I did a small survey of voter registrations in 1920 and 1940. So you can see selected Chinese and Japanese American voter registrations here that are mapped onto Los Angeles. So you can see parts of where Chinese and Japanese Americans would have lived, as well as some of their partisan affiliations. And I think you'll find this information interesting. So in 1920, and this is based on a very, very, very small sample size. So you can see in 1920, I collected about 79 entries of probable Chinese American voters. 1940, there's only about 153. But you can see how people register to vote at this time, or what they put as their partisan affiliation. And partisan affiliation doesn't necessarily mean that they cast ballots for Republicans, right? You can identify as a Republican but vote for a Democrat. This is just partisan identity. So we see in 1920, almost everybody who was Chinese American in Los Angeles were registered as a Republican. By 1940, right, so the Great Depression has happened, Roosevelt has been elected as president. By 1940, it's about half and half. So there is this kind of data that is available. It takes a lot of work to kind of comb through, and that's why this is a longer term project that's going to come out that I'm going to be working on after my book comes out, which I'm still working on. So I'm looking forward to kind of continuing this as a long-term project and seeing kind of how broadly we can expand this work.
This is an interesting topic to really take a look at some of the data that's available and see if it might extrapolate into actual policy or actions within the community, whether that has changed in terms of over time, in terms of the political direction of the community.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that my own father was definitely a diehard Republican, simply because he, like many, left China during the period of turmoil, and many supported the anti-communist environment that I think was common in many of our communities. So many, of course, aligned themselves with a party that would protect their families and their social interests and political and economic interests in China. Here, though, I mean, obviously, like I said earlier, each of the parties has changed, and now we're all wondering where we will all end up. And I'm sure that YC would ponder the same kind of question himself. It is past 8 o'clock and a little bit past. Are there any burning questions out there? I didn't see anything else in the chat. Maybe you might.
Yeah, I have a question, Gene.
Okay, go ahead.
I put it in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry. I missed it.
My impression was that there were so very few voters that the primary reason why the Chinese had some influence was because they were able to raise money for these political parties and political people. And this was probably kind of strong because you had things like the Zhonghua and these other groups that attended political fundraisers. And it was, I think, out of proportion to the number of people who actually could vote in the Chinese community. And I think the other thing is during the early 1950s, I think many local Chinese thought that China fell because of the Democrats who were in power during the late 1940s after the war. So I think it's two things. One was that the Chinese Americans were able to raise money out of proportion to their numbers, and this other thing about the fall of China.
Do you have a specific question that you wanted to ask, or did you just want me to
Well, I
comment on
was
that?
wondering if you had any idea of how much money actually was raised, or if the influence was more monetary than the number of voters.
Oh, I see. Okay. I think it depends on sort of what section of the Chinese American community you're looking at. Because if you're talking about kind of the multi-generational Chinese American communities along primarily the West Coast, so sort of the San Francisco, Los Angeles, many of the communities that I'm studying and writing about in my book, um, these communities were not exactly rich. The Zhonghua, which is the the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, also known as the Six Companies, they I do not know if they have financial records available, but I have not seen evidence of major donations from that organization to political candidates in the 1960s or 70s. If there were donations in an earlier period, I have not noticed substantial evidence of that either, at least not from the records that I have seen. Um, there were, on the other hand, due to the Cold War era, right, and the 1949 events of 1949, the rise of the China lobby, there was a new community of Chinese Americans that emerged that did have money. And so somebody who's kind of emblematic of that Chinese American community is Anna Chen Chenault, Chen Xiangmei. And so she was, you might know her as the widow of the Flying Tigers war hero, General Claire Lee Chenault. And she married him when he was very old and she was very young. It was a love match. When he died, she moved to Washington, D.C. and set up there as a major Republican fundraiser. So you might be thinking about her. She ends up being a major part of the China lobby, gets involved in a sort of controversial scandal in the 1968 presidential election where she intervenes in Vietnam peace talks to throw the election to Richard Nixon. But she represents a very different kind of section of Chinese American community and history that does intersect in very important ways with the kind of Y.C. Hong community that I also write about. But in many other ways, their circles and their sort of ways of operating politically were also very different.
It's good insight, and also another insight kind of a question, and maybe we'll close with this last one from Sue Ellen. She wanted to ask if her his wife's influence on some of his thinking. That Mabel believed in active social engagement, and whether that influenced his decision to become involved in whether it's Republican politics or other community politics. Uh, how did that play out? You shared a lot of insights, and uh, I think this is all very worthwhile. I look forward to seeing the book, and hopefully I'll get my hands on it soon. Maybe
Hopefully, I'll have it done soon.
we'll have some further discussions about that. But anyway, so maybe this, and I think one of the themes that you shared earlier on was, there was maybe a pragmatism, or maybe maybe not necessarily an active positive feeling that we could overcome some of these barriers, but he still felt that it was important to be involved and engaged. Your term defensive politics, I haven't seen that term before. And so I think you've enlightened some of us on how one person viewed, an approach to dealing with social equality or social justice, whatever you might call it, whatever the goal might be. Uh, so, so perhaps you saw in his notes some interplay or some encouragement from his wife that might have motivated him to express what he shared with the larger public.
Hmm. I
What do
don't
you
know
think?
that I saw sort of, Mabel push him. I think they were both, and of course, Nolan, if you'd like to comment on this, feel free. But I think I really what we have available in the archives is a record of two people who are both very driven in their own right. Um, Mabel was deeply involved in Chinese American student organizations and kind of different kinds of social and civic clubs and activities. During World War II, she was very heavily involved in fundraising and relief for China during the Japanese invasion. So she was always kind of very much involved in her own right in different kinds of activities at the same time as Y.C. Hong is involved in things on his end, right? I think where there is something interesting is Y.C. Hong talks about how, yes, I at the time the C.A.C.A. only admitted men. It was sort of structured as a fraternal organization, and so only male citizens were allowed to become members, even though, of course, there were women citizens like Mabel. So Y.C. Hong says something like, "Oh, I wish that we could find more Chinese American women who could be politically engaged and active like yourself, but they." I don't know if they weren't able to find enough members, or maybe there was reluctance to kind of change the fraternal structure of the organization, or what have you. But that's one of those interesting kind of moments of insight where I think Mabel was pushing him and was questioning what YC was doing, and you really see them in these letters as a match of minds, right? A match of equals.
Yeah, that was what sparked my earlier question here. What was discussed at the dinner table, and whether that might have influenced the direction of the family or of the people around the family. So anyway, well, these are great insights, and it's a very uh, studied and intellectual observation that I think we're making here, uh, because he was not a political, well, at least not in the what we might consider as a political person or political figure. I mean, he was a lawyer first, I guess, and then and presented arguments, whether in court or before Congress. I guess he was always had that uh, 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 professional reserve, I guess you might say, that really uh, didn't didn't show the more outgoing side of what we sometimes see. Like many lawyers become politicians, whereas I think he would make observations, and I think this is what I'm getting, what's coming out, I think, from your review of his works.
I mean, I think YC Hong was a realist, right? He saw what the situation looked like for Asian Americans, for Chinese Americans, and he knew how he could exercise what kind of influence he could, and he would push where he was able, and where he wasn't able, where it wasn't realistic to him in his mind, right? Then he would accept that it wasn't realistic.
So he was a realist, and that
I think
maybe,
so. I think he
yeah,
was absolutely a pragmatist, right? He was somebody who was incredibly intelligent, looked at the world around him, looked at his own capabilities, looked at his community's abilities, and made decisions based on the choices that he had available to him.
yeah. I think many of the people around me are very much that way also. I think we can close out this evening. I appreciate your sharing your insights and some of the things that you have learned with our community, and hopefully it'll spark some more discussions within the community. I guess we can just close out. I appreciate all of you who attended and asked questions. Uh, we're always learning, and it's amazing what the Huntington has archived uh, in terms of both the personal records of many individuals, many of his clients, but also his own writings and observations in the community and the political spectrum. So we really appreciate Vivian. Thank you again for sharing your research and your observations with us. And to everyone else out there, I bid you all a good evening. If we're in Chinatown right now, so uh, we just might have a little after meeting snack over here. But in the meantime, have a happy, warm, safe evening to everyone out there. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you all so much for attending and listening.